On this video, I'm going to talk about some of the dynamics around the civil suit brought by Ms. Grace Jabbari against Mr. Jonathan Majors. Specifically, the three things that I think that Team Jabbari is concerned about, worried about, maybe even scared of.
You the one?
Yeah.
Wow!
Sorry, baby.
Y'all are so fine together. Talk to me about creating the outfits together. Like, do you say, honey, I like this, you look good? Who picks out what?
And as you could see from that, the media, at least the entertainment media, had moved on. The page had been turned, and of course now Team Jabbari files this lawsuit. And in reading the lawsuit, I'm going to go through the three things that I believe that Gang Grace is really afraid of. Starting with number one, the attorney for Jonathan Majors, Priya Chaudhry. What they come very close to arguing here is that his counsel talks too much, does too many interviews. He does too many interviews. He's saying that he didn't do it, or that the story as told by Ms. Jabbari, his ex-girlfriend, was inaccurate. He has every right to do that, and his attorney has every right to do that. They're clearly scared of Priya Chaudhry, and they clearly want Priya Chaudhry to stop talking. They want her to stop talking. They want her to stop doing interviews, and the reason for that is clear.
Under prior district attorneys, not Alvin Bragg, they would not bring a case unless they had a good faith belief that they could prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. But I have heard from numerous people in Alvin Bragg's office, including people in the sex crimes unit and the domestic violence unit, that they just believe women, and that they now have, and they use the word, an appetite for bringing cases they wouldn't bring before.
Number two, in my opinion, is they are afraid of the arrest. They're afraid of this whole thing where, of course, Grace Jabbari was arrested for assaulting Jonathan Majors. And, of course, not prosecuted by the Manhattan DA's office, but she was arrested. Number three that they're scared of is any media whatsoever in which anyone is talking or defending themselves in this case. Those are the three obvious things that are highlighted in this case that tell me that they are very concerned about these things. They come up again and again. Number one, Priya Chaudhry, Jonathan Majors' attorney. It's pretty clear that Team Jabbari is afraid of Jonathan Majors' attorney, who is very vigorously and very energetically representing him, not only in court, but in the media as well, but mostly in court. And I actually think it was sort of surprising to see some of the arguments made in this lawsuit, which seemed to indicate that somehow or another people who are accused of a crime do not have the right to vigorous counsel. I think that notion will be laughed at, even in a very liberal jurisdiction such as New York. But in a federal court, I suspect that there's no way that anyone's going to rule that an attorney cannot vigorously represent their client. Obviously, people have to tell the truth as they know it when they represent their client. There's nothing that has been said that I heard in court on the Majors case from his counsel, from any of his counsel, that sounded factually inaccurate. There certainly were a lot of objections from the prosecution in court. One would think that if Ms. Chaudhry had said something inaccurate in court, we certainly would have heard about it in the form of an objection and so much more. So but I do think it's obvious in this complaint that there is a fear of Priya Chaudhry, and I'm not surprised because she is certainly vigorous in her defense of her client. There isn't any of this trying to placate Me Too, which I think is completely impossible, quite frankly. The way that it works is that if you're not fighting hard, you will lose. You will lose by default because the media, of course, is 100% on the side of the accuser, no matter what the details of these cases are. And particularly if you are representing a black male client, you'll notice the difference in coverage between this case and so many other white men in Hollywood who have been accused of something. Notice that we haven't seen any deep dive investigation of Ezra Miller, of Roman Polanski, Alec Baldwin. We haven't seen 40 people get interviewed. We haven't seen any of that with any of these other cases and much more serious allegations. The second thing in this complaint that it seems to me that Team Jabbari would appear to be afraid of, it's just media appearances in general. Certainly they referenced the ABC interview that Mr. Majors did.
First of all, stop it. Celebrities do the big interview all the time. You've never in your life seen a lawsuit act as if it was defamation because a celebrity did the big interview defending themselves in a situation. So that right there is an amazing thing. Like I said, these are the amazing things that you see when a black person is involved. And again, particularly in a justice reform setting and a black male is involved, you see these unprecedented arguments that you've rarely seen before.
Footage. You feel that you did anything wrong on the night of March 25th? If you could relive that night?
I wouldn't have picked her up. I wouldn't have picked her up. I wouldn't have put her back in the car. I wouldn't have tried to keep her in the car. I would have gotten out that car and ran immediately.
I would say that this sort of definition and classification that he somehow attacked Ms. Jabbari in that interview is inaccurate.
A situation that I, in many ways, put myself in.
If I'm wrong, I want to hear about that in the comments. If somebody can cite the time code of when Mr. Majors attacked Ms. Jabbari in that interview, please remind me. Now, I will say ABC did sort of an annoying job in terms of chopping that interview up in a lot of different pieces and putting those pieces out at different times on their streaming network, on GMA, this and that. That got slightly annoying. So there's a chance maybe I didn't see all of the interview, but I think I did see all of the interview. And actually, what surprised me about the ABC interview, which is much referred to in this complaint, is that Mr. Majors really talked more about himself, his own actions, mistakes that were made. He very clearly stated that he should not have placed Ms. Jabbari in the back of the car the way he did. He said that. He said that was a mistake. The famous September 2022 candle incident, he said that was a mistake. It really focused more on his decision making than it did anything that Ms. Jabbari was doing. And at one point during the interview, he actually said that he loved Grace.
The prosecution has described your relationship with Grace Jabbari as tumultuous and abusive. How would you describe that 2-year relationship?
I loved Grace.
Which I was actually surprised to hear, particularly finding out later that Miss Good was sitting on the set during the interview, and he said that. So I thought to myself, that was interesting. Particularly interesting given the fact when we look back at some of the footage, there doesn't seem to be a great deal of joy between these two people, Mr. Majors and Ms. Jabbari. Certainly nowhere near the same way as we're seeing with Miss Good. There seems to be some real chemistry, frankly, between Mr. Majors and Miss Good. I don't want to get too much into that. That whole thing is none of my business, but just looking at the two of them on video, I mean, they seem to really click. So I do think that Team Jabbari seems to be afraid of any media appearances, which is a familiar thing. And as somebody who's handled a few of these crisis management cases, it's typical that the defense wants the other side to shut up, because if the other side shuts up, they win by default. So they're always pushing to get the folks that are on the side of the accused to shut up. And I'm going to be very blunt here. I do think that there are some characters and some lawyers that are related to the Me Too movement who do not believe in due process and do not believe in the presumption of innocence, and in fact are trying to kill those things. They're not going to say that, but their actions and their amicus briefs in certain cases indicate exactly that. I'm not saying that's particularly the case with Ms. Jabbari's attorneys, but this is a familiar theme, this idea that you do not have the right to defend yourself. You do not have the right to say that the things as alleged were not true and didn't happen in the way as alleged.
Of course, when we talk about black men in the United States, we can't have these discussions without the full context of our history, particularly as it pertains to black men. There are some aspects of reading this lawsuit that, quite frankly, remind me of the infamous U.S. Supreme Court case of 1857 of Dred Scott v. Sanford.
Even free black people in the North could never be considered citizens. He wrote that black people, quote, are not included and were not intended to be included under the word citizens in the Constitution, and can therefore claim none of the rights and privileges which that instrument provides for and secures to citizens of the United States. He stated that when the Constitution was framed and adopted, black people, quote, had no rights which the white man was bound to respect.
Why do I bring up the Dred Scott case in reference to a movie actor? Well, because some of the arguments made by Ms. Jabbari's attorneys come very close to arguing that Mr. Majors has no right to vigorous counsel, has no right to defend himself, and has no right to talk. Of course, they're swinging for the fence because they know that we live in a society that is not very partial to black males. This is the type of argument that you can make and get away with it. The fact of the matter is, almost nobody in our society stands up for black men. That is a fact. That has been a fact for 405 years in this country. They know that we live in a society that is not particularly kind to the group that Mr. Majors belongs to. What am I talking about? A few examples.
Chesapeake man has been exonerated.
First time in 40 years, Chesapeake native Roy Watford III is a free man.
Conviction from 1976 in Westchester County overturned. The 72-year-old was exonerated by DNA, which made history as the oldest exoneration by DNA in the United States.
After 40 years, I'm finally going to get closer to this and clear my name.
Words of a wrongly convicted man determined to move on with his life. Maurice Hastings spent nearly 40 years in prison for a murder he did not commit.
It's a man who spent more than 40 years in prison for 3 murders he did not commit is now free. A Missouri judge ruled that Kevin Strickland, now 62 years old, was wrongfully convicted.
I don't like to compare cases. Each case is different. None of those people are Jonathan Majors, but I'll tell you what. There's a lot of references to history when it comes to everybody else, when it comes to women, when it comes to misogyny and patriarchy, all good. But if you're going to do that history, do all history. Just to punctuate the point, as I make this video, today is the day that 6 cops in Mississippi were sentenced for torturing 2 black men. So what happens in history connects present day for everyone, for all groups, and we need to recognize that, including black men. When have we ever seen a misdemeanor assault case blow up like this? Just give me one example, black or white. Again, Alec Baldwin in the background shot somebody dead on a movie set, and you don't see half the drama that you see in the Majors case. Again, the most famous misdemeanor case in all of U.S. history. You think I'm overstating it? Go read these 2 books on the great investigative journalist Ida Wells, and then come back to me and tell me that I'm overstating it. One of the big pieces of evidence in this case that would indicate that Mr. Majors might actually have a point here is being chased down the street by Ms. Jabbari block after block in New York. That doesn't look like the actions of an aggressor. That doesn't look like the actions of a person who is terrorizing somebody, a person who is trying to get away from somebody and spends the night at a hotel 70 blocks away from their own residence. That doesn't seem like the characteristics of somebody who is an aggressor in a relationship. I can't think of another situation where I have seen that, where somebody who is supposed to be some big perpetrator that's putting somebody in fear all the time is actually running away from that person. There's a lot of references in the case about Ms. Jabbari being in fear of Mr. Majors, extreme fear, fearing him, extreme fear. The term extreme fear is used, I think, 2 or 3 times. And the imminent danger of him and fear. Well, chasing him down the street doesn't look like a posture that I would relate to somebody who is fearful of somebody. That, along with the fact that Ms. Jabbari text messaged Mr. Majors 32 times in the night in question. These things don't sound like the types of things that happen when you are in fear of somebody. When you're in fear of somebody, you typically don't chase them down the street for block after block. Also, we have, of course, the testimony of the driver that night. And the driver said very clearly in court that, look, she was doing everything. He was doing nothing. He was trying to get away from her. Now, I know the media wants to ignore these facts, but that was what was heard during that testimony. And it is inescapable. But the other thing that's inescapable is the video of John Majors running down the street, which, of course, the New York Times and Rolling Stone don't want to discuss.
I was scared. With the red flags, I found that, I use this word, I said, oh, this is dangerous. This is months before the incident. I should have been brave. I should have said, no, this isn't working. And I should have walked away.
The third thing in this complaint that I think Team Jabbari is very afraid of is the arrest of Grace Jabbari.
Grace?
Hi, Grace.
Grace? Do you have a comment, Grace?
How do you feel about being charged with a crime?
That was widely covered. I mean, there's all these allusions in the complaint about international media that's helping Jonathan Majors. I thought that was particularly laughable. With the exception of TMZ, I think Entertainment News or E! News and The Messenger, which is now out of business, there was no media on on the side of Jonathan Majors. Oh, the other one was Business Insider. Business Insider actually reported pretty straight up and down. But let's just be real here, okay? 95% of the media reporting on this case, Deadline Hollywood, Hollywood Reporter, Variety, Rolling Stone, New York Times, all had negative reporting for Mr. Majors that left out a lot of things, quite frankly, that would have, I think, changed the face of the story. And if you want to see an example of that, look at the March 19 story in the New York Times on the lawsuit. Remember, what's in the lawsuit is not substantiated as fact. And there's new, never before heard information in there that is not substantiated as fact. But the New York Times repeats it and amplifies it. This idea that everything is sort of a cartoon character in these cases sort of pops up in the narrative writing of a lot of these stories. It's always kind of a Little Miss Riding Hood versus the big bad wolf type of presentation. But in real life, usually there's a lot of gray areas, and both sides in a relationship tend to make mistakes. But what you see in a lot of the reporting, and this is not new in the media business, when a black male is involved in these stories, you often see this very sort of one-sided narrative that is sort of clearly in the direction of the woman who's doing the accusing, particularly if that's a white woman, which it is in this case. There's a tradition in media in this country that is inescapable and very consistent, extremely consistent. And what you see in a lot of these stories is the total leaving out of anything that Miss Jabbari has done that is a little bit questionable. Certainly the 32 text messages, the chasing Mr. Majors down the street, the two separate scenes of them getting out of the car and her, grabbing at him and him trying to get away from her, the completely leaving out of the narrative, the fact that he stayed at a hotel in an attempt to stay away from her and then gets locked out of his own place and then has to get in through the super. And then she's on the floor half naked in his closet or bathroom. Everybody leaves that out of the narrative because of course that makes the story a little bit more gray area than I think a lot of these publications want to make it.
New York City 911, you need police, fire, medical.
Hey, it's medical?
No,
suicide, I think.
What is the location?
252.
They want the narrative that they want, and that narrative harkens back 150 years in this country to the days of Ida Wells in the late 1800s, where, the media is a partner in crime with the mob against any black male accused of anything. And that history is real, that history is true, and that history is undeniable. And the reason that I bring it up is that we hear so much, and we heard so much in court about, of course, we heard about domestic violence victims, which we should. We heard about misogyny. We heard about the patriarchy. We should hear about all of that. All good. But as I'm going to say it again, if that history is important, then why isn't the history of race and the way black men are treated important? That I have a problem with. There is no consistent treatment there. And I do think, just generally speaking, that the way that Mr. Majors has been treated in this matter is a beautiful example of the bias, the inherent bias that you see in a lot of news reporting. For a misdemeanor case, for a man who's had no history of arrest, no criminal history, no cops have been called, nothing. The rest of Ms. Jabbari is clearly something that the attorneys, as they write in this complaint, are very afraid of. And in fact, they classify it as somehow Team Majors knowingly filing a false report. And that's a really interesting classification when we know that there are photos of Mr. Majors and that he was scratched in the face and arm,
allegedly by
Miss Jabbari. I don't see any big denials of that coming out of Gang Grace. I mean, I don't see denials that she caused those things that we saw in those photos and that were not shown as evidence at trial. So, but clearly they are very nervous about the arrest. I'm surprised because really the arrest was not covered for very long. It came into the paper and then it was gone. And it never comes up again, really. It comes up and then, of course, attached to that. And you can see that the Manhattan DA's office made sure that it was attached to that she was not going to be prosecuted. And that was the end of it. I mean, it never comes up again. So I was a little surprised to see in this complaint constant references to her arrest. And clearly they are, but it's not just a reference to her arrest. They are claiming in the complaint that it was intentionally in some way falsified and false information. And I'm thinking, really? I mean, so it's an interesting thing to know that those are the three things they're scared of. They're clearly scared of Priya Chaudhry. There's no doubt about that. I mean, and they should be, because she is a very vigorous advocate, as you have to be in this current environment, this environment where we see a pushback from the so-called progressive left against due process and the presumption of innocence. Remember, all of these groups, particularly the group that is assisting Ms. Jabbari, refers to her as a victim of domestic violence. They referred to her as such before the trial even started. I mean, it's basically like, we've decided that he's guilty. We've decided that she is a victim, and we don't need any evidence to clear any of that up. We are defining her as such, and all of these groups do that. So let's just get real about the fact that if your brother, your father, your son is accused, you want an attorney like Priya Chaudhry, okay? And I dare say all of these people who are involved in this case, if one of their male relatives was falsely accused of something, or accused, period, falsely or not falsely, you're going to call an attorney just like Jonathan Majors did. So with that, just wanted to outline the three things that appear to be of major note to the folks in Florida who are assisting Ms. Jabbari with her legal case. Of course, there are things in there that Majors' side will have to explain. Obviously, the text messages from September 2022, but just wanted to outline the three things that I think are clearly on the minds of the plaintiff in this civil suit. This continues the saga of the most famous misdemeanor case in history. Just goes on and on and on. Nobody can convince me that if this wasn't a Hollywood actor with a big name and a lot of money in the bank, that any of this would be happening. None of this would be happening. And what you're going to see next is the things that are built, the content that is built off of what happens when a celebrity is involved. News stories, books, documentaries, you name it. I have an organization that's running a promo off this case, and it all gets extended by, of course, this civil suit. We'll see what happens next. I'll be back soon. Good luck.